yes, I'm just agreeing very deeply with a lot of what Pat said about this very strange shock that this COVID period has administered to our very fast-moving kind of model of Western culture, how it's forced us all to slow down, to curtail some big areas of consumption that we've become often very addicted to, particularly the amount of travelling that we do in certain areas of consumption that have been shut down because the shops and so on where they take place have been deemed non-essential. So it really has been a massive, massive shock to our way of life, and it has brought many things to the surface, as Pat says, both negative and positive. I think on the positive side of it, if you want one perfect distillation of that, some of you will probably have seen already a piece that was written about a week ago by the journalist Jen Stout, about who comes from Shetland, but who has been, she says, travelling throughout her kind of 20s and early 30s looking for somewhere else, you know, somewhere that she could find for herself that would replicate that sense of community. And she says she has never found it until the COVID crisis. It was only in this crisis that the community where she lives in Glasgow seemed to her to become present as a community again. And I've been doing interviews about what's happening in the world of theatre all the time during this. And one of the most striking interviews I did was with a young theatre maker in Leith who has a history of mental health problems and also is a carer for her mother who has severe physical mobility problems. And she said that undoubtedly during this crisis, she feels less alone with those problems and more surrounded by a community that's willing to support her and help her than she has felt any time in the last, you know, sort of 15 years. So I think one thing and one very sharp lesson is the extent to which the very fast-paced life that we've been leading in the last kind of, you know, 30 years has excluded people who can't keep up with that. To the extent of making them opt out of work, sending them into sort of mental health problems with depression and isolation and all the rest of it. And it's made us into quite a cruel society. And looking back, I can see how I've done it myself. Always too busy to stop, always too busy to talk to people, always rushing to catch a train, always rushing to get to the airport. You know, it's not an attractive way to live. So in terms of making the post-consumerist world more attractive, I think foregrounding that thing that we need to have time to be caring and community-minded and family-minded individuals is something that we really need to do. I think it had been particularly marked in Britain, that we kind of lost any sense, a lot of us, of having a right to time to do all of these things. You know, it's like our time has been divided between sort of sleeping, eating, a wee bit of socialising and working. And we've started to tolerate very high demands from our employers and the people that we work for in terms of their inroads into the time that we should have to be citizens, to be family people and to be part of our communities. So I think that's a really important thing that's happened, and I'd very much recommend that article by Jen Stout. You should find it easily just by Googling her name, S-T-O-U-T, Stout, Jen Stout. Anyway, the shocks, though, have also had kind of political impacts, and it's taught us things about the nature of our economy, how much of it is non-essential, and that wouldn't have been the case, say, back in the 1940s when people were tolerating the economic shock of war. At that time, a far higher proportion of the British economy would have been focused on essentials anyway. So the economic shock of sort of stopping non-essential activity would have been much, much less. Only a small leisured class had a lot of money for sort of non-essentials in those days. So we've learned that about ourselves. Even more crucially, we've learned, and this is a big moment, I think, and one that we really must try and hold on to as we move into the post-COVID period, we've learned how skewed the sort of values of that society are. I mean, we've learned that not one of the workers that we now consider key, care workers, NHS workers, people working in the food chain, supermarket shelf stackers, people who drive food lorries, people who pick and work in the food industry, the food production and preparation industry, all of these people have traditionally been really low status, really badly paid, and not just badly paid, but routinely exploited by things like 0-hours contracts, which make their work insecure and which also make it unsafe for them and for others. You know, one of the most poignant headlines I've seen was one about the Skye care homes epidemic, which was horrible. And this epidemic in a care home in Skye, and one of the union representatives said there, those workers don't want to be tested because they can't afford not to be able to go to work. So, you know, if you've got a situation where people's work is so insecure and the social security net supporting them is so weak that they can't afford not to work, then how can you safely deal with an epidemic at all? And if you're looking for one reason why Germany has dealt with this epidemic so much better than the UK, it's because of that. People there feel secure that if there is an emergency like this, the state will support them. I think in Britain that a lot of that belief has tended to collapse. So along with that questioning of the economic values of society, of who we pay most and who is really essential to us, we've also, I think, got a questioning of institutions. I mean, I won't ramble on about this because I think most people in Scotland are very well aware of it, but it just has been a huge crash course in how completely unfit for purpose a cabinet which was chosen for its loyalty to a fantasy project of Brexit, backed by a load of lies sort of put forward by certain interest groups, how unsuitable that cabinet has been for this crisis. They've been selected for their willingness out of pragmatism or perhaps out of sheer lack of insight to sign up to a project that everybody knew was flawed and to swear undying loyalty to an opportunistic leader, Boris Johnson, who was prepared to put that project through. And the fact that we have a set of institutions which can't prevent that, which hasn't been able to bring to book the law breaking by that Leave campaign, which has left us in this crisis with a UK government of such kind of poor quality and performing so badly, so mendaciously, everything from manipulating figures to just not doing things which they've said they'll do, to the delayed, so the sort of delayed action at the beginning of the epidemic when we could have taken steps much quicker and kept our death toll down. All of that has been a real shock to people's faith in British institutions, and we'll just have to wait and see how that plays out. But obviously it has implications in Scotland, which could or might not, depending on how things evolve, lead to a bit of a surge in support for independence. Scottish Government very much tied up with that flawed response to COVID,
couple
but
minutes,
still dealing with it better. Sorry, is that 2 minutes?
Sorry, there's a couple minutes, yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Great, thank you. So, unlocking the future, which Pat's already talked about, in ways that will mean a lot to everyone who's been involved in particularly community activism over the last 30 years or so. But I think what we have to think about, I think, at the sort of traditional political level, if you like, is what are we going to do with this new role of the state that has kind of emerged during this? You know, they've discovered a magic money tree. They've done things they said they could never do. They're paying the salaries of millions of people across Britain as we speak, you know, up to 10 million on the self-employed income support scheme or the furlough schemes. They've suddenly found they can do all of these things. And what's more, if you look at the numbers, although it's expensive, it's not actually ruinously expensive. You know, they say it's as expensive as the NHS. Well, is 2 NHSs not a price worth paying for a whole sustainable future? You know, you have to start thinking like that. So the question is, can we get political forces in place with strong enough grassroots support to actually take advantage of that shift in perception about the role of the state, about the possibilities of what the state can do? Can we do what Spain has done in however flawed a way and move towards some kind of universal basic income that would free us from our addiction to the old economy in terms of the fact that it provides most of us with our jobs? If we could break that link between the old economy and people's economic survival, then I think we can move much faster towards a new world. I just want to put in, before I am rightly silenced, I just want to put in a droplet of a mention for the arts, which of course is my other great concern. And I think if we're looking at a new world and at new ways of making a post-consumerist society attractive and beautiful, then you can just see from the way people have reacted during this crisis that once you have the basics of food and shelter and so on dealt with, then the first thing people want to do is to sing songs and put them online and to communicate with each other, to record Shakespeare sonnets, to do all of that. And the arts, although it has its own carbon footprint issues, the way it's been done over the last kind of half century, particularly at the international level, nonetheless, they are a key way that human beings can lead really rich and fulfilling lives without destroying the planet, without consuming stuff all the time, because what they're basically consuming is their own imagination, their own inspiration, and their own capacity for joy, which is fantastic. And everybody in Comrie knows that, because you have such a terrific amount of arts going on there in that community. And the very last thing is, I think we have to think about a new internationalism, because a lot of the positive processes after this will be about, shortening food chains, coming down to a more local level in things like energy generation, having more community control of all of these big essential processes of our life. But we mustn't let that be at the expense of knowing that in that movement, in that change, we are brothers and sisters with all the people in other countries who are trying to go through the same thing. And so in the arts and in politics and in all the other big fields that matter, I think we have to work hard at developing new forms of internationalism that are light touch in their impact on the planet, but that still bind us together closely as human beings going through this huge transition. Thanks.